Hello everyone, welcome back to Fanblade. I thought this week, for a change of pace, it might be nice to talk about amplifiers for once, because we don't actually talk about amplifiers all that often on this channel. In fact, I think I've only spoken about amplifiers once in the context of my keyboard rig. Now, in that video, I showed off these two things. Now, these two lovely Peaveys here are a pair of KB60 keyboard amps, and they sound great, unless you're putting keyboards through them. They're 60 watts each, and that's not quite enough for my purposes. I have two of them because I like to run a lot of stereo effects, sort of rotary speaker sounds and things like that, and they do sound great on a Hammond organ. They really do. They sound fantastic on a Rhodes piano sound, but where these things really fail, and fail miserably, is on just a normal acoustic piano sound. These things just haven't got enough power to get to the volume that I require and still have the dynamic range to give my playing any sort of expression at all. Basically, if you want to get them up to gigging volume, you got to max them out, and then you're just flatlining dynamically, and that's no fun at all. And I also have a couple of specific requirements that I need from an amp. Because I am the bass player in the band, and then I want to go onto keyboards, my band and I have come up with a few interesting ways of keeping the low end going. So this is a Nord Electro 6 keyboard, and this is a modal Cobalt 8 synthesizer. This thing is set up to be a bass. It makes bass noises, that's all it ever does. It can do so many more things, and it's really easy to program. I have not even scratched the surface of what this thing can do, but it does make good bass noises. In addition to this setup, sometimes I need to play keyboard parts with this hand, and in that situation I hand the bass guitar off to our singer, who is also a very good guitarist in his own right, quite an accomplished bass player. He does just fine. However, in the last couple of years, since I've been bringing all manner of weird and wonderful and homemade basses to gigs, he's started being a little bit dissatisfied with some of my choices, and I totally understand that. It is absolutely his prerogative, and his right, in fact, to play an instrument that he is familiar and comfortable with. So he has started bringing his own bass to gigs. So let's count this up. My bass guitar, his bass guitar, this bass instrument, and a keyboard that I want to run in stereo, and suddenly amplifying all of this becomes a little bit of an issue. So I thought long and hard and long about what sort of a rig I was going to have to put together in order to get multiple channels of bass in the bass frequency range, and then good stereo separation on the higher frequency range, and then have all of that have enough dynamic range that the whole thing would sound good to me. Well, I built this. So this convoluted mess here is essentially a PA system in its own right. We've got a bunch of inputs, which at the back they get patched into a mixer at the top. We've got compression and EQ and a power amp in each box, which is powering, this one is powering the two PA speakers that are for the keyboards, and then the Angular bass cabinet here, 2x12 with neodymium magnets. It's light. It's so light. But all of this gives me infinite control of the sound, which means finding the right sound is almost freaking impossible. I spend the first 5 songs of any given show fiddling with it to try and make it sound right. This will do everything that I need it to, but I often find that I am not afforded the luxury of an hour and a half to sound check it properly. So what do? It's a lot of gear to bring to a gig to not sound good, especially when a lot of stages aren't that big. And this thing is actually quite big. Now, the elephant in the room at this point is, of course, in-ear monitors. Now, I am not opposed to the idea of in-ear monitors, but it's gonna be a tough sell to the rest of the band. There's a trend these days towards silent stages, and if I have to try and talk either of my guitarists into giving up their amps, then I'm going to have a bigger fight on my hands than I'm prepared to take on. Plus, aside from the occasional larger shows that we play a few times a year, often we're just playing in bars to 30 or 40 people at most. We don't have a massive elaborate PA system, we don't have a sound guy, we do it all ourselves. And the amount of sort of patching, monitoring, and cross-channeling and whatever else to get in-ears to work really just seems like overkill. And yes, I'm saying that having just shown you my backline. So now the remit for my rig is something punchy, full range, lots of inputs, but simple. I just want to plug it in, plug my bass into it, plug my keyboard into it, and play the music, rather than worry about frequency response and comb filtering and all these other things which have been giving me untold grief for the last 2 years that I've been using that setup. I just want something simple, which ironically brings us straight back to the Peavey keyboard amps. Because what I've discovered is that the thing that makes these terrible keyboard amps makes them great bass amps. And I'm not even kidding. They're only 60 watts each, but wattage isn't the only indicator of volume. It's the efficiency of the speaker and how well it's matched with the enclosure that it's in that's going to put sound that way. And that is really where Peavey have absolutely outdone themselves with these amps. You plug a bass into one of these and it will fill a pub full of 30 people. You chain 2 of them together and you can do even larger gigs. Now, just to illustrate the point, here's a short clip from a Christmas party that we played at the end of 2024. Even in this ambient recording, you can really hear how the compression, which kills the acoustic piano sound, really brings out the richness in the bass tone, and it's having no trouble at all keeping up with the rest of the band. It really is one of the best sounding rigs I've ever heard. They are multi-channel. You've got 2 channels with a high and a low input on each of them, so you can plug 4 things in. The real question is, what am I going to do about the keyboard? And really, you gotta have something with a massive amount of power. You've got to be able to have it set to gigging volume and still have plenty of headroom there for loads of dynamic range. And that means an extremely loud amp. Luckily, I just picked up this beauty. Peavey Special 112 guitar amp. This is the single loudest thing I own. It's also the dirtiest. I picked this up recently for $50. And that's actually what we're doing today. We're stripping this thing down, we're vacuuming the spiders out of it. It sat in storage for 7 years before I got it. It does work. I have turned it on, I've played music through it. Pots are scratchy, spiders are unhappy. There's a few things wrong with it, but let's get to it, shall we? Well, that is by a long margin some of the dirtiest Tolex I have ever seen. That's kind of what it's supposed to look like, almost. But yeah, that's just filthy. I mean, you want to talk about dirty, like there's actual dirt on it. The amp itself is actually in much better shape than I was expecting. I was kind of hoping it wouldn't be too bad, and it's not. Like, there's one dead moth there, there's a couple of cobwebs in the corners. On the whole, it's fairly clean, but it does have a few obvious problems. Now, at this point, I need to say as well, I am not an amp technician. I am not an electronics engineer. I have a basic understanding of how to do the mechanical function of soldering, and If there's an issue that's not visible, I will have massive trouble trying to diagnose it. Luckily, there are several issues with this that are very visible and should be relatively easy to fix. Now, the first, worst and most obvious thing is, of course, the condition of these capacitors. Now, I thought that these would have something wrong with them, and yeah, it looks like that one there has leaked a little bit of its electrolyte, and it's got a little bit corroded on the board. That doesn't look like burning to me, it looks very much like rust. That cap's going to need to be replaced. It's probably a good idea to do both of those, and while I've got the board out and I'm replacing caps, I'll probably do the two main filter ones as well. These are the high and low gain inputs, and you can see in this one where the end of a jack plug has broken off in the socket, so that'll be fun to get that out. We've got one smashed pot, and luckily the rating for it is printed very readably on the back. It's a 10kB. Incidentally, the A and B designations on pots, at some point they switched around. Some of them will be linear, some of them will be logarithmic. I think it depends on country and time period. So when I take this one out, I'm going to have to actually measure it and find out whether it is a logarithmic or a linear. I don't know. I don't know what it's supposed to be, but we'll find out what it actually is, and then I'll just simply get a new one of them. It's only a couple of bucks. And lastly, this is the input jack for the foot switch, and I do not know why, but the jack only goes in to that point, and something is jamming it. It will not go in any further than that. There's nothing obstructing it that I can tell. I'm wondering if that little spring contact there might be seized and it's simply mechanically not moving, like that first one does. Yeah, gonna have to look at that. There's also a moth. Let's vacuum that out. So on the whole, it's not too bad. It could very easily have been much, much worse than this. I think getting the board out to replace all these parts is simply a matter of taking the knobs off and unscrewing those pots, take the heatsink off the back, and then I think the board should just lift out. I can't see anywhere where there's anything sort of holding it into the chassis apart from sort of being suspended between the two sides. So let's get it apart, get these caps and that pot out, and clean the whole thing up. Should be reasonably easy. Now then, I've measured the smashed pot, and it seems to be very linear, so that's good. We know that that is a linear pot. Everything else appears to be reasonably straightforward. I was worried that all of this corrosion and everything might have seeped through to the other side of the board. Just looks clean. Like, that's not burning. Burning would affect both sides of the board. I would expect in most cases that heat transfer would damage both sides. But it's just corrosion. It's electrolytic fluid, which we're going to have to replace all of that. But on the whole, yes, I have marked the polarities on everything. I am off to the electronics shop to buy some capacitors and stuff. And I'm back from the shop, and I've got good news and bad news. The good news is I was able to find replacements for these two caps here. They are the ones that are leaking. They are mandatory to replace these. The bad news is I couldn't find a suitable replacement for these two, but they're not leaking. I think they're fine. Like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is my rule there. The other bad news is that these caps have the leads coming out the ends, and the only caps I could find that were suitable have the leads out one end. Now, That's not actually a problem, it just means that it's going to look a little bit strange when I hook everything together. What I'm actually going to do is simply cut these leads, rather than desolder them. I'm just going to cut them, leave a little bit of extra length there, solder these directly to them, and then I'll have to sort of find a way to twist it around and stick it on the board, because there's a height restriction as well with this one. And then just cover everything in a massive blob of hot glue. Like, it's not going to look great. It will work perfectly. This is not really the right way to do this. The right way to do this is to get the correct components and replace them, properly. But this will work, but it's not really considered standard practice. Bishop to Jack 4. Check, please. Alright, that is fairly much done. I managed to get the broken jack out of there without too much fuss. That was nice. The pot that I've put in there, it's missing its support. It doesn't have that angle bracket there. I'm not thinking that's going to be much of a problem, because it's all going to get bolted into the front panel anyway, as long as you don't go swinging on it too hard. As long as I'm not putting my entire bodily weight on it at any point, it's probably going to be fine. There is one more modification that I want to make to this, and it's not actually to the board, it's actually to the back panel. One of the things that I really dislike about these older style of amps is the fact that the power lead is hardwired in there, and no matter what you do with it, every time you've got to shift it, whenever you need to store it somewhere, you've always got this cable hanging out the back that you have to try and deal with. So what I like to do is install an IEC C14 plug. These go by a few different names actually. In New Zealand we would call it a jug lead, because traditionally our kitchen kettle would have this type of plug in there. I don't know what it's called in other types of the world. Maybe let us know in the comments what you know this as, but I've always thought it's a little bit silly calling them jug lead, because I haven't seen this type of connector on a jug for nearly 30 years. There's some important considerations when installing one of these. You've got to make sure that you've got enough clearance for everything, because I'd love to stick it about there. The trouble is, when this whole unit gets bolted into the chassis, it's got a bolt running right behind it, so I would have to move that over, but then I've got to make sure that I've got enough clearance for where the PCB starts. And it actually just so happens that with that in place, the heatsink starts there. I've got room to stick that in there, and that'll give me plenty of clearance on both sides. There's nothing else in this area that's going to obstruct it or risk contacting these, so this is fine. This is aluminium. It should be pretty easy to just cut a little hole in that. I've made this little template ages ago, which is exactly the right size, and that will just allow me to mark out on the back plate where exactly I want to put it. And then it's just a matter of making up some little spade bit connectors and soldering those connections on there. Now, I should reiterate at this point that I am not certified to do mains wiring. Now, I know what I'm doing, and I know how to do it safely, but if you are less than sure that you know how to do this safely, then please don't do this, because it's pretty simple, and it might be okay. But if you're not certain, then it might also go very, very badly wrong for you. So, yeah, be safe with this stuff. Electricity can kill you. Don't forget that. Alright, that is a completed, finished, reassembled unit. I am not all that pleased with the knob that I bought for that new pot. I think I will look for a replacement for that because that does annoy me. Apart from that, yeah, I think it might actually be time to clean the cabinet. Alright, let's talk Tolex. This stuff's great. It is the amp covering of choice for decades and decades now. It's basically vinyl with a cloth backing, so it's sort of got a similar lineage to duct tape in that regard, but it is a trap for dirt. And you can see this piece, this is the spring reverb cover, this is fully encrusted. We're going to have to do a full excavation of this. I'm wondering if we're going to find any buried treasure in there. If you ask, 10 different people, you will get 12 different answers about what is the best product to use or the best method for cleaning this stuff. And the truth is, you can basically use anything on it. It will react with certain chemicals like acetone, and maybe don't pour petrol on it. I am going to use some off-brand window cleaner and a toothbrush, and that's going to get me 90% of the way there, and if there's any residual muck left over, then just a damp cloth. We just wipe it clean. That's pretty much all it needs. I might put some gloves on, because this is going to be a filthy job, and I suspect I might be here for a while. Ta-da! Completely put together. I've opted not to clean up any of the rust on any of this hardware. I think it gives it a nice aged look, which is in keeping with the style of amp that it is. There's a certain amount of... I don't know, I'm not superstitious about mojo or anything like that, but, I kind of like it. I dig it. Let's assemble the stack. It works. Sounds pretty good too. That was very much the room sound that you just heard. I just have these microphones sort of dangling around the place, and so I just turned them all on. I'll mix it later. We're also not even close to being at stage volume. It is about 10:30 at night here, and methinks the neighbours would be nonplussed. All of those are sort of set between 1 and 2 on the volume dial, so there's plenty to go. But yeah, that's my gigging rig for 2025 and possibly even beyond. There are some caveats with this. Obviously, I've only got one keyboard amp, so I'm going down to mono for the time being. If I find a second one of those amps, then yes, I will go back to stereo quite happily. Also worth noting, yes, vintage Peavey amps are extremely heavy. Yes, the rig that I had before, the one that's stacked over in the corner there, that was significantly lighter. But because this is smaller, I can actually fit it all in the car and still have room for a sack barrow to wheel it all into the gig. So I don't actually need to lift anything except just out of the car onto this, and then I can just roll it the rest of the way. That is way more convenient, because with that massive stack of stuff, I couldn't fit this in the car. I had to load that all in manually. 2 cases at a time. 5 trips, plus instruments. No, I'm not doing that anymore. So there you go, vintage Peavey amps. Don't sleep on the vintage Peavey amps. They are available for a fraction of the price of a so-called better amp. They are infinitely repairable, even by a moron like me, and they sound good. What more could you ask for $50? Hell yeah, I'll take it. I'll take another one if anyone's got one. But until one of them pops out of the woodwork, I would like to say thank you very much for watching, thank you very much for subscribing, and I'll be back next week with something else once I've figured out what it is. Could be anything, you'd better come back and find out. Cheers.